Hello, I'm Jim Egan. I'm in the English department here at Brown, and I have the pleasure of introducing this panel and the panelists for subsistence. Sorry, it's still early for me. I apologize. Subsistence and resistance, and we have three excellent panelists today. I can't tell you, by the way, how excited I am to be here. I missed yesterday's proceedings because I was up in Boston at the Digital Public Libraries of America Fest. People in the digital humanities tend to have fests, not conferences, which I find interesting. But you all seem so festive. I'm sorry, I'm wasting time. From the panelists, you didn't want to hear about me. So let me just give you a little bit of background on each of our speakers, and then I will step out of the way and we'll hear each of them, but I'm going to give the introductions to everyone first. So first will be James Dator, who is currently a visiting assistant professor in the history department at Goucher College in Baltimore, where he also serves as interim director of the program in Africana Studies. He is currently revising his manuscript, tentatively titled Search for a New Land, Creole Power and the Black Awakening in the Leeward Caribbean, 1688 to 1748. Next will be Lauren Robin Derby, whose publications include The Dictator's Seduction, Politics and the Popular Imagination in the Era of Trujillo, and this won the Bolton-Johnson Prize. And she is co-editor of Activating the Past, History and Memory in the Black Atlantic World, and the Dominican Republic Reader, which is in press. Her paper today forms part of a larger project on demonic animal narratives in Haiti and the Dominican Republic based on oral histories which she locates within the longue durée history of the environment, especially the history of pigs, dogs, cattle, and wood on Hispaniola. She teaches Latin American history at UCLA. And last but certainly not least is Michelle Burnham. She is professor of English at Santa Clara University and the author, most recently, of Folded Cells, Colonial New England Writing in the World System, a book I love very much. Her current project, from which this paper is drawn, is The Calculus of Risk, Writing in the Revolutionary Atlantic Pacific. So those are our three speakers, and James, you are first, so I'll let you come up.
Thank you so much. This is, I feel so privileged to be among such brilliant thinkers. It's just great to be here. So, and also I'm really excited to share this idea I'm kind of working on, this thing I'm teasing out that I call the moral economy of the gods in relation to the Antigua conspiracy of 1736. So I think it's important to sort of situate this idea and where it relates to my broader work. So I'm interested really in the sort of the mechanics of empire and race in the British Leeward Islands, in that sort of archipelagic space. And as part of that, as a sort of subset of that study, what I'm really fascinated in is creolization, not in a sort of theological sense between like Creole to African or African to Creole, but really in terms of the ways Africans and island-born slaves fostered new cultural practices that would have sort of provided them with a sense of what I like to call a imaginary counterpower, right, in the slave quarters. So with this in mind, I want to suggest actually that the archive produced from the Antigua conspiracy trials are perhaps the most vivid account of the links between slave resistance and slave ritual practice in the British Empire prior to 1750. But another thing that's really fascinating to me, and something that I'm not really going to talk about at length here, is the ways in which we can actually understand the conspiracy and the trial archive that's produced as a sort of ethnographic event, in the sense that both judges and even recent historians are sort of invested in detailing accounts of slave ritual practice that, from the perspective of slaves, was really supposed to be things that were beyond human comprehension, right? So it's important to say that the conspiracy itself, or the plot itself, never actually materialized. Suspects were rounded up before the plot could be carried out, and the supposed ringleaders were executed almost immediately. As months of trials proceeded, hundreds of slaves were imprisoned, several were tortured, and At the end of the several months, 88 men were actually executed, and more than 40 were banished from Antigua. The judges were convinced that slaves were plotting to blow up the island gentry in the port town of St. John at the end of October. And during the trials, slaves testified to more than 20 feasts involving slaves from multiple plantations, many of them connected by larger kin networks. They also testified to several raucous public gatherings that occurred in open fields and near grave sites, and in other places slaves would have viewed as being infused with spiritual power. So most important of these public gatherings was this gigantic ritualized performance that took place in an open pasture just outside the port town of St. John on October 3rd, 1736. The event was rumored to be one of the largest events ever attended on the island. And in fact, many white testifiers suggested that they had never seen anything like it before, that it was completely novel in the history of Antigua, which I think is really important. The judges who were charged with trying the conspirators, they referred to this event as the country play, a sort of reference to its African origins, supposed African origins. And the play involved a ritualized procession, drumming, and ecstatic dancing that the judges maintained was a declaration of war. The judges called this dance the Ikem, and they spelled it I-K-E-M, and insisted that it signaled a grand plot to take over the island on behalf of slaves. So the judges also argued, importantly, that it was the result of nearly a year of planning. And they said that the key leader of this plot was named Court. And Court was a Coromantee, a slave born on the Gold Coast. But what's interesting about Court is that he actually came to Antigua as a child. So even though he was born on the Gold Coast, he was really familiar with the sort of diversity of black life that existed in Antigua in the 1720s and 1730s. And the judges insisted that Court's country play was actually meant to establish him as a, quote, king of Antigua in preparation for this grand rebellion. Now, I should say that although the judges really emphasized that the plot was advanced by these two groups, the Creoles and the Coromantes, it's clear from my research really that what was going on is there's sort of an effort to create inter-ethnic alliances on the island. And so just to break that down a little bit, first, there's no such thing on the Gold Coast as Coromantee identity. It's a New World invention, right? Historians often kind of suggest that Coromantee is slaves who are associated with some sort of Akan culture, but if anything, Coromantee identity was fashioned in the New World out of Old World cultural frameworks. Second, I should also say that the term Creole to refer to slaves born in the islands also collapses a lot of diversity. So Creole slaves involved in the plot, they weren't only born in Antigua, they also came from the French islands, and some came as far away from as Boston. It's important to say also that Creoles not only performed in Court's country play in 1736 on October 3rd, but they're also instrumental in planning the events that culminated in the country play. So they're particularly important for planning the feast, these large festive dinners that involve celebratory meals and often ended in ritualized oath-taking. So keeping my interest in creolization in the slave quarters and this diversity in mind, the diversity of the slave plotters in mind, I want to suggest that we can interpret the Antigua conspiracy as more than just a classic material conflict between masters and slaves, right? In fact, I actually want to ask, why is it that slaves from such a diverse array of island and African backgrounds may have actually believed something spectacular was afoot in the fall of 1736? So, as I'll argue, I believe that Court and his supporters were trying to create an Antiguan-style harvest festival, one that drew on wider African idioms that spoke to the intersection of spiritual power and its role in renewing an unhealthy or fractured community and their relationship to community leadership. In fact, I would even go as far as to argue that Court and his followers were aiming for an Antiguan revitalization movement, one similar to those described by historians of indigenous North America. And so I hope by the time I've presented my evidence, you guys are convinced of this. Now, it's critical sort of understanding the time of the event to understand what black islanders were going through in the 1730s. The fact is often overlooked, but by the late 1720s and 1730s, Antigua was often outproducing shipping more sugar to England than both Barbados and Jamaica in the 1720s and 1730s. And because of its rapid transformation to sugar production, the slave population actually doubled in 30 years. So it reached almost 25,000 by 1736, and blacks outnumbered whites in the island 7-1. In turn, slaves became increasingly dependent on their masters for supplying them the flour, herring, and sometimes beef from abroad. And so as sugar gobbled up the landscape, slave garden plots proved essential to supplementing the calories slaves needed to survive after laboring in the cane fields. And I should say that, in these garden plots, slaves, a lot of us know this, but slaves planted African crops, namely yams and sorghum, also known as guinea corn. So the rapid transition to monocrop agriculture placed Antigua in a very precarious situation between 1733 and 1736. Cycles of intense drought, followed by torrential hurricane-force rains, destroyed both sugar and garden crops severely during the years leading up to Court's country play. Now, in addition to severe weather, a new vermin began destroying the sugarcane, eating it from the inside out, and this is the blast that's immortalized in James Granger's poem, The Sugarcane. The blast, along with this severe drought, it fostered a massive decline in sugar production by 1735, and some accounts suggest that plantations lost upwards of 90% of their crop because of this combination. The cycles of drought and intense downpours not only proved disastrous for sugarcane harvests, but also flooded garden plots and rotted yams in their beds. And I grew up near cornfields as a kid, and one thing I remember was that when the soil would get really, really dry from the drought, it almost becomes like concrete. And so when it rains, all of a sudden, the water doesn't get absorbed by the soil, it just pools, it floods down. And so what happens after droughts and then torrential rain is that the water pools, it floods garden crops, but it also helps spread pathogens like dysentery in the islands, right? So standing water also provides a ripe breeding ground for mosquitoes that carry what colonists called the black vomit or the chocolate fever, what we know as yellow fever. And indeed, accounts from Antigua suggest that black and white islanders alike were dying in considerable numbers in 1734 and 1735, so much so that one islander said that Antigua was gripped by, quote, dreadful mortality. So for historians interested in the Antigua conspiracy from the slave perspective, it's tempting to just kind of stop here. It's tempting to argue simply that the Antigua conspiracy resulted from a subsistence and health crisis, that slaves pushed to extremes as their owners cut back on rations to save money, plotted a rebellion. But to do so couches our understanding of the event in reductive economic terms. It demands in some ways we view the conspiracy as a rift in the supposed moral economy that governed master-slave relations and helped keep slave resistance in check. Yet this kind of dialectical account does not account for the ways in which Africans and even island-born blacks would have understood such catastrophes. They would have understood them as events precipitated by spiritual forces in part, as events driven in part by the power of spirits seeking to cleanse Antigua of its social ills. So before proceeding, I just want to offer two reminders and one kind of new fact. It's probably not new to you guys, but first reminder, Court's country play took place in early October after weeks of public gatherings in open fields and celebratory feasting. Reminder two, slaves in Antigua faced a subsistence crisis and a health crisis with regards to loss of their garden crops, mostly yams and sorghum, and they also were suffering from probably bouts of yellow fever, if not dysentery. And the new fact, something that I learned from Robert Dirks quite a long time ago, but is that it's important to recall that August, September, and October are critical months, were critical months for slaves to regain their health after the extreme labor of the harvest and shipping season. So the early fall was the downtime. It was when shipping slimmed due to hurricane fears and increased insurance costs. So August, September, and October provided relative respite for slaves and enabled them actually more time to harvest the yams and sorghum from their gardens. So with this in mind, let's go to Africa, okay? Nearly 68% of all those who disembarked from slave ships in Antigua between 1710 and 1736 came from the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, and the Bight of Biafra. Now, although comprised of several distinct ethnic groups, languages, and states of varying size, they all rest in what we might call the Yam Zone of West Africa. This includes present-day Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, and parts of northwestern Cameroon. And this area, importantly, also shares common seasons because of their place in the intertropical convergence zone. And so I've represented this, like that transition? It's nice, right? Yeah, so I represented this in this map here. It's a little difficult to see, but this Yam Zone, so to speak, would be in this white area. And this is a map of language families in West Africa as well. Now, in the early modern era, yams were not only one of the major food crops in this region, but they also figured prominently in symbolic ritual affairs relating to social order and health. Despite their linguistic and cultural distinctiveness, communities across this region conducted annual community-wide festivals timed to coincide with the harvest of the yam. These festivities, while being conducted according to specific ritual practices, actually share much in common. So I should note that while the Ashanti and Akem of present-day Ghana and the Igbo and Yoruba of Nigeria all celebrate variations of these, quote, new yam festivals, yams are not the only crop honored during the harvest season. Ga speakers along the coastal region of Ghana, for example, celebrate what they call homowo, which literally translates to hooting for hunger, and it honors the first harvest of sorghum, also known as guinea corn. And like the events taking place in Antigua, all these harvest festivals take place between August and October. Even fishing communities had their own harvest ceremonies of sorts. So Dutch factor William Bozeman, who lived on the Gold Coast at the end of the 17th century, noted that in the fishing villages near him, locals would make their offerings to the sea spirits in August or September when the fishery was at its low and the fish harvest was meager. So, in all honesty, though, to call these events harvest festivals really misidentifies them, okay? These are seasonal events that are far more complex than a simple celebration of a good crop. They involve a heightened sense of communication with the spiritual cosmos, especially with local ancestors and spirits that inhabit key places such as fields and streams. And communities appeal to these spirits to purify the land and provide sustenance. And thus the spirits are particularly important during moments of famine and want. And as such, the events are highly ritualized and actually involve months of planning. The planning, preparation, and timing of the events is essential because participants need to properly make appeals to their ancestors and tutelary spirits who, it is hoped, will respond to these moral obligations by using their powers to heal the community. All of these events are community-oriented and rely on wider kin networks. They tend to begin within the sphere of the family and village before blossoming into a broader union of celebrants. And families first honor neighborhood leaders and key ancestors before they gather in a central location, usually a large town or marketplace where the roads converge, and they do this in a symbol of unification in the face of community fracture. So the form and basic function of the events is fascinating when we read them in tandem with the conspiracy trial records. In Antigua, whites and blacks both testified that slaves were gathering in large crowds in open pastures and at crossroads in the months leading up to court's country play. And as noted earlier, suspected plotters celebrated during the months leading up to the performance with these large feasts, these celebratory feasts. And my research indicates I've been able to sort of map out who's involved and map out what plantations they came from. And it turns out that most of them are actually connected across plantations via kin networks. Now, if this evidence seems tenuous, this evidence about Harvest Festival and the Antigua conspiracy seems tenuous, I should say that in Jamaica in the early 19th century, slaves celebrated what they called yam time. Yam time involved large, kin-oriented family gatherings, and generations of men and women typically gathered at an ancestor's burial place, sacrificed a cock or a goat, and then proceeded to a central meeting place to have a feast and dance with their neighbors. A slave interviewed in 1824 remarked that during yam time it was, quote, customary for us to have all our friends about us. And in Jamaica, yam time takes place in September. And just before I arrived here, I learned that in Curacao in the 19th century, the entire island celebrated the harvest of guinea corn in September as well.
So, why did the judges, or perhaps the slaves who testified, think that these feasts, public raucous gatherings, and especially court's country play had anything to do with the martial order of Antiguan society? Well, harvest festivals in West Africa were and still are actually much more than just celebrations of a new crop. Their events wound up in the understandings about the ways in which ancestors and spirits actually wield power over the world of the living. They're aimed at revitalizing and reuniting the community through ritual acts of purification and cleansing, often in the face of collective strife. And their public, well-rehearsed nature highlights the interrelated yet ambiguous tensions that exist between centralized authority embodied by key leaders, the broader community of interconnected households, and most importantly, the spirit realm that governed community sustenance and health. And as such, idioms of cleansing and purification figure prominently in these celebrations, especially in events like the Ashanti Ojira, which is depicted here on screen, which Gold Coast Coromantee slaves like Court may have been familiar with. Now, I should note that early 18th century Europeans had only a limited understanding of these themes of purification, but they did sort of note them. Bozeman, for example, described the community rituals he saw on the Gold Coast as events aimed at driving out the devil. And significantly, while outsiders, Europeans, usually call these events New Yam festivals, in the Gold Coast Kingdom of Ashanti, Ojira literally translates as to cleanse or to purify. In part, its purpose is the cleansing of community ills and social tensions, particularly those that exist between the living and the dead, but they're also supposed to remedy tensions between the community, the spirit realm, and the Asante king or Asante Henna. But in order to carry out community purification, community leaders, people like Court, would have had to rely on special diviners. In the Ashanti case, these diviners are known as the Akimfo. And after years of training, they developed a special ability to communicate with the spirit realm and convey the demands of the spirits to the world of the living. And they not only relate the message of the spirit realm, they actually become the living vassal of the spirit on earth in the dance called the Akem. Now, some scholars describe the Akem as a possession dance, as something marked by frenzy movements and a, quote, trance-like ecstasy. And during the dance, the spirits incarnate swing wooden swords wildly through the air to cut a path forward for their safe arrival in preparation for the cleansing of the landscape. But the arrival of the spirits only occurs after the village leader arrives at a central meeting place of the community, usually under an elaborate bright umbrella such as those you see there. Now, these motifs of purification and cleansing offer a dramatically different view of Court's country play, one that suggests that slaves in Antigua may have had a more complex understanding of the workings of their domestic economy than we've considered before. Indeed, some slaves testified that Court even attempted to have what they called a canopy of state made for him in preparation for his performance. And accounts differ as to whether he marched into the pasture outside of St. John with this umbrella overhead. And rumors circulated after he was rounded up that another slave actually took it and hid it from authorities when the trials started. But what really convinces me of this sort of cultural approach to the Antigua conspiracy is the linguistic slippage that occurred when the judges tried to fit slave testimony about the performance into their own narrative. As mentioned earlier, the judges claimed that Court and his followers performed what they spelled the IKEM. And they claimed it was a shield dance marked to announce a war. But as my research suggests, what they failed to realize was that slaves were actually testifying about the arrival of a tutelary spirit, one coming to cleanse the Antiguan landscape of its disease, impurities, and perhaps social inequities fostered by the sugar regime. So when Court finally arrived at the central sacred meeting place outside of St. John to music and considerable fanfare, his followers, many of them from the Gold Coast, some from Igbo country, and many born in the New World, swung wooden lances, much like the Akamfo do when they cut the wind and announce the arrival of the spirits to come purify the land. So to conclude, when we consider the timing of Court's country play, the role of purification and unification in these annual gatherings in Africa, the dire need for spirits to revitalize Antigua in the face of disease and broken markets, and especially the Akem dance itself, it seems to me that we need not only interpret the events surrounding the conspiracy as a breakdown in the hegemony of the master class, but also as a moment when slaves from a variety of backgrounds would have been seeking spiritual solutions to to what we would call worldly problems. So perhaps Court and his followers believe that in order to combat the extreme conditions thrust upon them in 1736, black Antiguans needed to return to their lost moral obligation to the very gods that they believed had a much greater influence over the landscape than the men who viewed black life in simple terms of profit and cost. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for letting me be part of this conference, which has been incredibly stimulating, and for enabling me to share some of my work in progress. It's been very exciting because actually my first trip to Hispaniola was because Brown University gave me an Arnold Fellowship. So I'm coming back to Brown too after 30 years, and that's also, a wonderful homecoming. And I also want to thank Juan for setting the stage for my paper. In October 2010, during my visit to Banica Elias Pina, which is a new fieldwork collecting oral histories in an area in this zone, which is Banica and Tomasik are sister towns. Banica, for most of its history, was in Haiti, but today is in the Dominican Republic. A small town in the central frontier of the Haitian-Dominican border. Javier Serrano killed himself early one morning with a shotgun as a crowd of neighbors formed around the house to console his wife and son who were left cleaning up the carnage. A discussion ensued over what must have caused the tragedy. Many friends of Javier's wife in Banica are nurses, and they wondered why his wife had not previously sought psychological treatment since he must have suffered from depression. But a parallel and quite distinct conversation emerged among some of the men, most of whom raised livestock for a living. A story commenced that the current syndico or mayor, Roberto Serrano, was responsible on the grounds that he had a large herd of cattle in the border in Haiti, one that mysteriously grew just as everyone else's was diminishing. Some said that there were reports that Javier had been seen in Haiti, where he vanished, reappearing as a mute animal in the herd, implying that his spirit had been sold to the vende gente, the people sellers in Arcaí, as a form of nefarious border commerce that accrued wealth to Roberto. This narrative also indicated that these cattle were not actually livestock, but rather shapeshifter bacas, or spirit demons. It also recast the death of Javier from a suicide to a murder due to envy at the hands of his cousin and political opponent, Roberto. So this is a baca in the form of a pig turning into a child. But I'm dealing, of course, with the cattle ones in this story, in this paper. This essay considers the story of Javier's murder via sorcery in relation to several narrative clues, especially the fact that Roberto was said to have conducted his ill work via demonic cattle. It thus follows Carlo Ginzburg's methodology of following inadvertent details which may reveal otherwise unseen underlying logics and forms of affect not apparent in historical documents. As Reinhard Koselleck has said, in moments when language is struck dumb, rumor and sorcery may afford a window into the preconscious domain of sentiment and sensibility related to the past before they were edited out of the record. Bacas appear in many animal forms, yet they conjure very different threat perceptions depending on whether they present as dogs, pigs, or cattle. While all are shapeshifters, dogs and cattle are more akin to vampires than werewolves due to the prevalence of blood imagery that accompanies them. These stories of spirit demons which graphically slaughter their prey convey what Neil Whitehead has termed the poetics of violent death, the cultural expression of violent bloodshed and mutilation, here imaged through a surrogate beast. I propose that these bovine Bacas stories express the danger and vulnerability of the experience of those who formed part of the 17th and 18th century hunting and contraband economy of the border. These rumors may be said thus as visceral indicators of the potent threat that was part and parcel of a lifestyle based on hunting and selling feral cattle as contraband, and the particular kind of harrowing man-beast encounters it involved, especially for freedmen who may have at times been vulnerable to being swept up again as slaves. The fear and loathing invoked by these beasts thus conveys historical memories of the cattle economy which articulated the Haitian-Dominican border in the 18th century, as the French plantation economy grew and came to rely on Dominican cattle as a meat source and surrogate currency. These tales of changeling cattle are also reflective of a particular phenomenology of interspecies relations characteristic of this cattle economy, and similar to Spain, channel a fusion of man and beast and a cult of the feral bull characteristic of hunting and extensive cattle ranching. When Columbus arrived on Hispaniola, the only four-legged animals he found there were small rodents, but that was soon to change with the arrival of cattle, pigs, horses, and dogs from the Canary Islands, where he stopped en route. Over time, these animals formed immense feral herds that became a primary food source for the conquistadores. Later exports of hides, tallow, and salted beef formed the basis of the buccaneering economy, which arose parallel and in sharp distinction to sugar, and wild boars furnished a lively and profitable trade in tallow as far as Cartagena. Indeed, the cattle trade emerged as a byproduct of sugar and cacao at a time when oxen and mules were needed to power the mills, move the cane, and feed the population, making meat an exceedingly important commodity in the 16th century. Ranching was a common precursor to sugar throughout the Antilles, and cattle provided leather, which served many purposes. But cattle had a special significance in Hispaniola due to the isolation of the colony, since given the scarcity of species, it was used as a virtual currency on the island, and frequently was the only means these penurious settlers could through which these penurious settlers could acquire slaves and imported goods. Hispaniola was the first cattle frontier in the Americas, and ranching culture spread from there to the greater Antilles and beyond to Venezuela. Pigs and cattle adopted very rapidly, soon becoming the primary protein source for early settlers, and immense herds of the densely wooded interior formed an important component of what Jarvis has, in the context of Bermuda, termed an Atlantic commons for the poor, an extra-imperial frontier zone where social outcasts from former bondsmen to runaway slaves could subsist on extracting resources such as wood, salt, pearls, and turtles, and thus maintain a subsistence base outside of the core settlements where mining and later sugar and slavery ruled. Jarvis has stressed how this economy of sojourning men was a vital part of Atlantic maritime trade, providing essential raw materials upon which other industries relied. On Hispaniola, cattle and pigs formed the basis of a thriving hunting economy, one which sustained freedmen in the interior to the detriment of agriculture. This frontier society held appeal for its autonomy from forced labor, but this must have been reinforced by the Andalusian and Canary Islanders' preference for livestock raising over farming. This sugarless society offered unusual access unusual access to imported commodities and upward mobility for a select group of mixed-race mestizos who formed the first Creole society. Illicit trade networks linked them along the north coast with eastern Cuba and other secluded contraband ports such as Fort Royal, Jamaica, as they provisioned ships, replacing the rations of putrid salt beef and rotten biscuit that were the norm. As neighboring Saint-Domingue grew into a sugar plantation powerhouse in the 18th century, the entire eastern Spanish portion of the island redirected its trade towards commerce in cattle with Saint-Domingue. Even though the majority of trade was conducted over land, commerce with British, Danish, and Dutch ships was also important, as flour, wine, butter, salt cod, cheese, and porcelain were swapped for wood, hides, and tobacco. Antonio Sanchez Valverde, a mulatto priest writing in 1780, classifies the cattle subcultures into three different groups. The atero needed access to land and depended upon state grant lands for grazing. The ranchers had agregados or corraleros, which were kept by the dozens and maintained close to home. Then there were also the mansas, which were castrated and left free outside the township. But most of the cattle lived in wooded areas outside of town in mountainous areas of sparse habitation. These were called extravagantes. Although the first two forms of ranching required only a few field hands who were given unusual autonomy since they followed the herds alone for weeks at a time, these latter feral animals demanded a very different set of techniques. A work group was called upon and a pack of dogs was formed, and on horseback with lances and jarretera, they would corral a group of animals into a rodeo or roundup and then down them by grabbing their tails. In his words, they would stop the horse, get off quickly, and throw themselves on the animal before it can get up, twist the nape of the neck, grabbing the horns, the tips of which they try to stick in the ground when they can, and in this way they keep them muzzled as long as they need. This was a highly dangerous and labor-intensive process, and most often ended up in the death of the beast, although occasionally two could be tied up and transported. Once trade had shifted from primarily exports of hides to live cattle sales to Santo Domingo in the 18th century, this method diminished in use. The fourth type were the mantarreses or bravias, which lived deep in the woods, rarely saw people, and these animals would flee on sight. They would be located with dogs, subdued with a whip, until the hunter would assault the furious animal body to body with the lance. As Sanchez Valverde notes, the profit was small given the exhausting work. The artero had to be vigorous, strong, agile, and have an intimate knowledge of the terrain. He worked on horseback, which afforded him a higher status than the Montero hunters who routed out boars and small game on foot. Edward Long of Jamaica objected to the subculture due to the avenues for upward mobility it enabled. His discussion of the related freebooter economy provisioning small maritime vessels holds a highly disparaging view of the audacity of freedmen who had stolen their own manumission. By sharp contrast, Sanchez Valverde, himself a descendant of freedmen, reveals a certain veiled pride in the bold antics of Afro-descended corsairs such as Lorenzo Daniel, the most important of the second half of the 18th century, who worked with a group of Creoles and Canary Islanders, who brought much-needed imported goods and contraband slaves to Hispaniola at a time when a full 2 years could pass without a Spanish ship stopping at a local port. Santo Domingo became the central stage of the freebooter economy. They served as a coast guard and even penetrated the local elite. Sanchez Valverde defended the leather trade on the grounds that it supplied labor, which was key to growth and prosperity, as well as necessary imported tools, since Daniel is said to have introduced over 1,000 slaves between 1720 and 1750. As Sanchez Valverde states, nobody is more courageous than the poor, and these Creole pirates were highly respected for their vigor and nautical skills, and though their bounty was enormous, you can see how they relieved the suffering of a miserable island. Given the demographic preponderance of Wolof, Fulani, and Mandingo slaves among the vaqueros of the interior, John Thornton has presumed that African-derived ranching practices were the norm on Hispaniola. Given the lack of available labor with the demise of Amerindians, a system developed using only a few herders working with long spikes. On horseback, the lanceros would sever the animal's hamstring, remove the hide and tallow, leaving behind much of the meat which sustained the packs of feral dogs of the interior. Indeed, the technology used in cattle rustling was derived from West African practices. However, the enormous wild herds of Hispaniola prevented a very different kind of challenge than that of the Senegambian context, where a combination of castration, water scarcity, and partial nocturnal penning actually tamed the cattle. It is true that Hispaniola hunters deployed the Wolof lance, worked on horseback, and milk products were an essential component of their diet. However, the close specific codependence between man and beast, both their cattle and their horses, starkly differentiates the West African precedents from the hunters of Hispaniola. These hunters worked in a group, but felling the cow required engaging in a man-to-beast tussle with the animal, a highly dangerous operation in which one risks one's life, one which left the hunter covered in blood and often injured from the sharp horns. Similar to the Spanish bullfight, which revisits the drama of bullfighting with lances, this was a theater of cruelty as well as a stage where concepts of honor and masculine valor were showcased. There's evidence that this long history of pastoralism has left its mark on the popular culture of Hispaniola. For one, elements have made their way into figures of speech, such as when an 18th century priest complained that his flock lacked pasto espiritual, or spiritual nourishment, through the metaphor of pasture, since they were insufficient priests in most interior towns. And while a rancher might classify all quadrupeds together, since many kept various kinds of livestock, including cattle, pigs, goats, oxen, and mules, popular taxonomies resist this kind of bundling. Indeed, while it may surprise, perhaps due to the close proximity between man and beast in ox-driven plowing techniques, oxen are the only livestock on a Dominican farm that are named, and often they're given names like Rosita, these kind of intimate girlfriend names. And a beloved black mare, of course, owned by a poor family, provides a national allegory in Juan Bosch's classic, La Mañosa. Black is night with a telltale Creole characteristics such as being cunning but lazy, skillful, yet obstinate. Pastoralism's reverence of animals is evidenced in Creole forms of magic. In the 16th century, a slave woman accused of witchcraft in Puerto Plata prepared baths from animal fat, which she mixed with imported herbs, and she broke spells using the water from a scalded dog. And in Haiti, protective work lamps are animated via oils combined with animal body parts, depending on the spirit in question, such as the gallbladder of an ox, a sheep's brain, or preferably a pierced beef heart. Invoking the forest which used to provide shelter to these feral beasts, these lamps were placed in trees. Cattle were thus used as actants in agentive magic. The fact that these animal parts were coupled with items such as dirt and gunpowder indicates that their class is petro, which is associated with powers of the foreign. This may be due to the fact that livestock came from the eastern Spanish range, and Don Pedro, who is said to have founded the Petro line of spirits, is also said to have come from the Spanish side of the island. What's striking, however, is that while cattle do figure in popular culture, when they do, they're kept at a distance. This is a vaca in the form of a cattle by Jose Bedia, who's a Cuban artist who resides in Santo Domingo. Yet the cult of the wild evident in this feral cattle complex has made its mark on popular culture. The bull is a popular representation in the spirit world as part of the iconography of the spirits Bosu, Tuacon, Kolfu, Mapaka, and Torlisa, which are called upon for very grave problems. This is a Haitian artist who makes sorcery bottles. Bosu Tuacon has 3 corns, and I'm showing them to reveal the ubiquity of horns in some of the most potent of magical objects in Haitian Vodou. Bosu Tuacon has 3 horns. The unnatural extra horn serves to remove the image from nature and give it a supernatural, supernormal status, and renders it unequivocally sacred, according to Don Cosentino. Cosentino proposes that this melded with the Robosu, which is a sacred shapeshifter monster of the Fon royal family of Benin. The horns seem to provide a visual metaphor for power and force, indicating a spirit who will fight for its own and appear with frequency in voodoo imagery, from sacred vivid drawings to power objects. This is Fausto, a guy who works in the Central Frontier, and has this incredible altar with a huge horn in it. I'll give you a full frontal. That's his with a vache at the top. Okay. Animals are often used as sacrifice in Haitian and Dominican voodoo rites, but they're most often poultry or pigs. Given the history of wild cattle rustling, not surprisingly, cattle are the most distant and dangerous of these tropes of the wilderness. In Edmund Leach's classification in the ritual pantheon, the bull is a distant stranger who is known to exist but with whom no social relations of any kind are possible. Yet the buccaneering economy did incorporate these figures of the wilderness into a regime of hunting, predation, and consumption, which enabled a rare affluence for plebeian men. As such, the figure of the bull came to signify both remoteness and nearness, a combination of distance and intimacy, which Leach would describe as tabooed ambiguity, which can give rise to supernatural monsters which are half man, half beast. Indeed, this may help explain why 2 of the most popular figures in Haitian Dominican Carnival are here's more. Fausto also works. He was showing the skull, which is a part of of his major altar with the horn in it, and he was discussing why he has to have a skull in the altar. And there's another altar with a horn in it. So this may help explain why the 2 of the most popular figures in Haitian Dominican Carnival are Diablo Cojuelo and the Lancet Cod. The Diablo Cojuelo of the Dominican Republic is a devil with bull horns, which carries a bladder or whip with which he strikes at children. He's the wildest spirit of the underworld and descends from medieval Spain, and thus references the culture of extensive cattle ranching and cult of the bull of Spain. The Lancet Cod appear in troops. They mask their faces, wear bull horns, and blacken their skin with cane syrup and soot, carry whips with which they're said to be able to change people into cattle. The whips are said to be made out of the umbilical cord and intestines of an infant. As Catherine Smith explains, they are spiritual mercenaries sent by feared secret societies to transform people into animals. But they're not transformed into just any animals. They create bulls, which they cannot eat because they themselves are cattle. So they're traded, they trade the bulls that they create at the market or sacrifice them. As she writes, both the whips and the terrifying transformation into cattle evoke the terror of slavery and the transformation of people into chattel. But it may also resonate with the ambivalent legacy of the cattle trade, which on the one hand forged an important community of resistance for subaltern men outside of the plantation economy, one which was very dangerous, while later serving as a proto-currency used to purchase slaves. Rosalind Shaw would argue that contemporary rumors may have a deeper historical reach then, via what she calls palimpsest memories, which invoke the experience of slavery. In this peripheral backwater region near the battlefields of the northern Artibonite plain, where the Haitian Revolution took place, slaves were primarily obtained via theft and contraband, and contemporary rumors about demonic shape-shifting cattle thus may be layering events into a longer historical trajectory. Moreover, during the Haitian Revolution, some revolutionary chieftains became entrepreneurs liberating slaves from the French, only to turn around and sell them to the Spanish. In fact, Georges Biassou was one such commander who started trafficking in French slaves when he switched alliances to the Spanish. And in fact, today the Haitian hamlet across the Artibonite River, which I showed you in that first slide, the sister city of Bonica is named after him. If Biassou's predations are conveyed in local memory, this may well explain why. These narratives recount a story of unspeakable violation in embedded language that otherwise could not easily be uttered. To conclude, this paper has argued that the central frontier zone of Hispaniola, the figure of the wild bull has become a palimpsest of historical memory with several embedded layers, commencing with the extensive cattle contraband economy of the 17th century, which turned feral cattle into hides, through the 18th century cross-border trade from the east to the west in live cattle, to allegations of a contemporary illicit trade in Haitians, which I didn't discuss in this paper because lack of time, in this case from west to east, because Roberto, the accused, is also said to be trafficking in Haitian labor. That's another story. Just as the story of cattle in the Haitian-Dominican border represents a local history of articulation with global capitalism, it's one which assumed a particularly predatory form, so it's not surprising that its here is associated with blood and violence. Originally a creature of empire brought by the Spanish, which created terror and dislocation for the Amerindian population, the bull has since been creolized, empowering magic that's seen as dangerous precisely because it's associated with individual gain in the cash nexus. Yet this is a logic that also inverts history, since cattle were once a form of currency that turned men into slaves, yet today the lancet cord turns people into cattle, and the bossu toicon helps people solve the most intractable of problems. As Shaw has said, the theory of memory suggests a different way of remembering the past, one in which violent processes are incorporated into cultural practice, but also recast in the process from practices of predation to empowerment. Thank you.
Those were both fantastic papers. I, of course, work in literary and cultural studies where, we for a long time discussed and debated the canon and worked to sort of expand it by recovering forgotten texts. And after a day here, I was sort of getting the sense that sugar has a kind of canonical status in historical studies, right? So sugar's kind of like the Shakespeare, or at least the Melville of Atlantic history, right? This sort of figure or topic that it's difficult to see around, either because it was so dominant or because the sheer quantity and depth of scholarship that's been done on it makes it so dominant. So this paper is sort of my effort to look around sugar outside of the plantation by looking at a literary text that only recently has really been recovered, reissued, and studied. This paper both draws from and extends a long book chapter on the novel Obi, or The History of Three-Fingered Jack by William Earle. Published in London in 1800, but set in Jamaica during the 1780-81 slave revolt of Jack Mansong, Obi builds an anti-slavery argument that I argue fundamentally relies on the language of plants. It does so by aligning human bodies with plants All right, if there's shape-shifting in OB, it's between humans and plants. And representing the slave trade as a destructive form of transplantation and amputation, which there's plenty of in the novel, although I don't talk about it in this particular paper today. Earl's novel was clearly in dialogue with a number of late 18th century texts that engaged with Jamaican horticulture and agriculture, including histories, natural histories, medical treatises, and poems. In this paper, I look at this constellation of texts to consider the treatment of three plants, plantain, sugarcane, and breadfruit, and their alignment with the three very different horticultural and political economies of the provision ground, the plantation, and the botanical garden. Reading Obi in this context reveals that Earl counters the imperial project of what several scholars call economic botany with the revolutionary logic of a vegetable economy that understands rebellion as a natural botanical response to the violent transplantation project of Atlantic slavery. But I also want to begin by insisting that this Atlantic textual archive be read in transoceanic context, and in particular with discourses and practices of botany and agriculture that stretched between and connected the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Damon Salesa, in his contribution to the recent collection, The Atlantic World in the Antipodes, notes that while the Pacific and Atlantic share deep histories of colonialism and imperialism, they have a rather shallow shared historiography. A focus on plants offers one way to begin the interdisciplinary enterprise of connecting oceanic histories. And it's worth remembering that breadfruit, plantain, and sugarcane were all transplants from the East to the West Indies. By the late 18th century and the age of Joseph Banks, ships were regularly charged with moving plants between the hemispheres in what Jill Cassid describes as the global traffic in plants. No project epitomized this more than William Bligh's 2 transoceanic voyages conducted in the aftermath of both the American Revolution and Jamaican revolts like that of Mansong and the earlier Tacky's Rebellion. As Greg Denning explains, the bounty was transporting the breadfruit tree, the very symbol of a free and unencumbered life, from the island of freedom, Tahiti, to the islands of bondage, the West Indies, and their slave plantations, end quote, including Jamaica, where the trees were delivered to, and today still grow in, the botanical garden established by the planter Hinton East. Indeed, as Cassid reminds us, our visual imagination of the Atlantic tropics has been, at least in part, literally formed out of the organic matter of the Pacific since plant transfers to the Caribbean from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the South Pacific so radically transformed the landscapes of the Caribbean islands that those species of flora most symbolically associated with the tropics were precisely those plants by which the British grafted one idea of island paradise onto another. This grafting exercise was appealing because it hid beneath Pacific fantasies of paradise, bounty, leisure, and profit, the Atlantic practices of exploitation and experiences of labor, suffering, disease, and loss. Breadfruit in particular promised an almost pharmaceutical solution, a kind of herbal remedy to the social, political, and biological ailments stemming from the plantation economy and its cultivation of the sugarcane plant, a scenario in which Polynesia's Tahiti served as a kind of antipodian antibiotic for the Caribbean's Jamaica. But Jamaica hadn't always needed to import the illusion of utopia from so far away. Edward Long's Popular History of Jamaica, originally published in London in 1774, counteracts reports of the island's unattractive environment by evoking a portrait of a landscape so lush and luxurious that its lands in pasture as well as in culture require an unremitted attention to free them from weeds and young trees, which would otherwise infallibly spring up and multiply in all parts, like the hydra's heads, end quote. A description that masks labor with an image of super fertility. He notes the example of one large cotton tree on the island's south shore that was felled and left to rot on the ground. Its limbs had been all cut away, but there remained a very small twig of 2 or 3 inches length growing on the middle of the trunk. This, as the under part of the trunk next to the earth decayed more and more, seemed to be recruited with a copious supply of nutriment, and in 3 years' time grew up into a fine young tree, several feet in height, rising like a phoenix from the parent dust. It became an absolute reproduction. Long evokes a natural world so fecund that even dead plants magically reproduce themselves. Although the hydra's head of the cotton tree calls to mind potentially threatening images of revolutionary unrest, Long takes pains to romanticize the natural world of Jamaica into what amounts to a sugar plantation pastoral. He describes fields of sugarcane, quote, which spread through the vales and climb the hills till they blend with the deep green forests. As the cane first grows, it assumes a delicately light verdure, which gradually darkens to a stronger green until a sweet mixture of white and yellow indicates its maturity. Into this scene appear the busy slaves, like reapers armed with bills instead of sickles to cut the ripened items, and teams of oxen in the field to bring the treasure home. Finally, the sun's majestic orb graces this pleasing and picturesque scene at sunset, leaving a trail of splendor aloft, which streaks the clouds with the most lovely and variegated tints that the happiest fancy can imagine. Long claims to have found in Jamaica the idea realized of a poet's romantic vision of, quote, some utopian island, blessed with perennial verdure and unfading spring. Interestingly, Long turns to Asia to remark on the only improvement Jamaica might make on its natural bounty. It could, he says, imitate the Chinese method of forming terraces, since leveling the hillier terrain would make it as fertile and commodious almost as plains. In his later History, Civil, and Commercial of the British Colonies in the West Indies, Brian Edwards directly compares Jamaica to its Pacific counterpart, Tahiti, devoting nearly 5 pages to detailing, quote, the wonderful familiarity observable in many respects between our ill-fated West Indians and the natives of the South Sea Islands. He notes that Jamaica's crops include plantains, bananas, yams of several varieties, callaloo, edos, cassava, and sweet potatoes, while the Tahitians are supported by the breadfruit and the plantain, both of which flourish there spontaneously. Edwards places the West Indians ahead of the Tahitians for generating a wider variety and abundance of food, breadfruit excepted. A later edition of Edwards' history concludes its section devoted to Jamaica with a 34-page catalog titled Hortus Eastensis, which lists the 1792 contents of Hinton East's Botanical Garden. This is just 1 page from it. But you can see the origins of many of these plants. In a third 1801 edition, this catalog appeared at the end of the book's 3rd volume, devoted to narrating the history of the Haitian Revolution as a cautionary tale of, quote, the danger to which every island in the West Indies would be exposed from such an example. The botanical catalog is arranged by Linnaean classes and includes plants such as guinea pepper, common ginger, and turmeric from the East Indies, sweet-scented olive, spotted ixia, and starry gardenia from China, aloe from Ceylon, honeysuckle from Russia, and lilac from Persia. But this catalog follows a table that outlines by county the proportion of Negro slaves to sugar plantations in the island of Jamaica in 1789, as if the exotic order of the Asiatic plant catalog provides an antidote to the unruly dangers represented by the African population table. Edwards also notes that Jamaica's botanical garden did not thrive until the British captured a French ship in 1782, which happened, quote, to have on board some plants of the genuine cinnamon, the mango, and other oriental productions, end quote, indicating the ways in which these gardens were populated through plunder and fertilized by the mulch of empire. Richard Drayton insists that Bligh's missions and the botanic gardens to which they were connected were very public gestures of solidarity with the West India interest, and points out that Edwards's history sought to turn the botanic initiatives of his fellow planters into an emblem for the enlightened caste of their administration. Indeed, royal botanic gardens in the second half of the 18th century became instruments, he says, through which kings, or more proximately their ministers, sought to show the virtue of their authority, such as George III's plan for Caribbean botanic gardens to serve as an entrepot through which Asian and Pacific plants brought by Bligh on the Bounty would be introduced to the West Indies, and through which New World plants would return to Kew. Bligh is a fit emblem for this enterprise, for before traveling to the Pacific on Cook's third voyage, he had worked for an uncle in Jamaica, carrying rum and sugar on merchant ships across the Atlantic, from the island colony to the island empire, a trip he completed no fewer than 10 times over a 4-year period. Bligh therefore transitioned from running the products of slave-driven sugarcane plants across one ocean to running breadfruit plants between one ocean and another, designed to feed those slaves cultivating sugarcane. His voyage is also an example of the great care and concern naturalists took to transport seeds and plants, expending considerable effort and expense to ensure that their specimens survived the voyage and arrived safely to their destination. In fact, scholars have recently pointed out that many ship captains were reluctant to accept biocargo, especially live plants or animals that put demands on a vessel's limited supply of space and water far out of proportion to the profit they promised. On the Bounty voyage, for example, food for the sailors was carefully and obsessively rationed out, while the pots of breadfruit absorbed enormous space, both in the great cabin and on deck. The first act of the mutiny for which Bligh's voyage is now most famous was, Greg Denning notes, to throw overboard the breadfruit plants. A transoceanic reading that places accounts of the slave trade alongside accounts of the plant trade reveals cargoes of expendable human bodies alongside cargoes of indispensable plant specimens. Earl's Obi, to come back to the novel, enters into this dynamic by treating human bodies as plants and investing them with a kind of revolutionary botanical politics, better represented by Plantain than either breadfruit or sugarcane. The title page epigraphs from Robert Southey and Erasmus Darwin both situate revolutionary abolitionism in the context of plants and plant products. Here's a close-up of the epigraphs. The passage from Southey's well-known sonnet urges anti-slavery activism through the refusal to consume the product of the sugarcane plant, while the Darwin passage condemning slavery comes from his popular 1791 2-volume poem about plants called The Botanic Garden. Darwin's book catalogs the world's plants and their uses, but as the title of its first volume, The Economy of Vegetation, suggests, it also presents a kind of ecological politics, which identifies revolution as the inevitable result of the mismanagement of organic life. He characterizes the circulatory system of plants, much as he does that of animals, as animated by electric torrents that pour nourishment into, quote, the dull root, relax its fiber trains, thaw the thick blood which lingers in its veins. This electrical system of circulation applies for Darwin to the globe as a whole, for through all its, quote, realms the kindling ether runs. Darwin describes the American Revolution as fueled by the Earth's electrical forces seeking to restore its lost political balance, and Franklin's experiments with electricity become, in his poem, at once scientific and political. Quote, the patriot flame with quick contagion ran, hill lighted hill, and man electrified man. Similarly, Revolutionary France is imagined as a natural response to the tyranny of confessors and kings who enchain liberty with steely rivets that locked him to the ground before he is touched by the patriot flame. The repetition of the phrase patriot flame explicitly links the American and the French revolutions to each other and associates both with these fiber trains, or vessels that carry electrical fluid through the bodies of plants, animals, and now nations alike. Darwin's treatment of these Atlantic revolutions moreover bracket his account of the Atlantic slave trade, which is precisely the section of the poem from which Earl takes his title page epigraph. If the histories of Long and Edwards are consumed by sugarcane, Earl's novel is dominated by plantain, the plant whose food the slaves overwhelmingly preferred to the breadfruit England had taken such care and expense to transplant. In 1787, the same year as the Bounty voyage, a law was passed in Jamaica requiring that provision grounds be supplied for slaves in order to reduce their reliance on imported food sources. The provision grounds allotted to slaves were, as Beth Fawkes-Tobin observes, typically located in mountainous terrain, unsuitable for sugarcane production, and at considerable distances from the slaves' homes. In addition to keeping slaves well fed, provision grounds provided them with knowledge about plant life that endures to this day in herbal medical practices that might be traced back to Jamaica's history of subsistence farming communities in the remote mountainous regions. The plantain grown in these plots was both food and medicine, for it could be used as an anti-edemic, anti-inflammatory, antiviral, or as a laxative, bactericide, or sedative. The description of the hideout of the slave rebel Jack in Earl's novel suggests, and it took me a long time to realize this, it's located precisely at or near such a slave provision ground. Jack's mountain hideout is defined by plantain. Plantain makes up his furniture, his food, and his medicine. In the cave where he brings the slave trader Harrop as his captive, Jack made himself a couch of grass, which he covered with plantain leaves. Quashie, the slave who captures Jack, first sees him cutting plantains. In the ensuing battle with Quashie's party, Jack loses 2 of his fingers before returning to the cave where he bound up his wound with a plantain leaf. Earl provides a footnote explaining that slaves are allowed a small portion of ground which they cultivate for their support after the labor of the day is completed for their masters, and an even longer footnote explains the many uses of the plantain tree. Here's part of that quote, which is cultivated on a very extensive scale in Jamaica, without the fruit of which Dr. Wright says the island would scarcely be habitable, as no species of provision could supply their place. Even flour or bread itself would be less agreeable and less adapted to the support of the laborious Negroes, so as to enable them to do their business or keep in health. Plantains also fatten horses, cattle, swine, dogs, fowls, and other domestic animals. The leaves, being smooth and soft, are used as dressings after blisters. The water from the soft trunk is astringent. Every other part of the tree is useful in different parts of the rural economy. The leaves are also used for napkins and tablecloths and are good food for dogs. As several scholars have argued, the provision ground represented slave agency, self-sufficiency, and power, a source of food for slaves and their families, but also for planters and their families, as the excess harvest from these gardens was sold in markets. In Obi, the provision ground and its plantain are the site of both subsistence and rebellion. Provision grounds were also where one might find those slaves infected with the disease of yaws, who were also often practitioners of obeah. Benjamin Mosley, whose treatise Cristobal talked about early yesterday, explains that before learning to control the infectious disease of yaws through inoculation, it was customary, quote, when a Negro was attacked with it, to separate him from the rest and send him to some lonely place by the seaside to bathe, or into the mountains to some provision ground or plantain walk. This is an image of a plantain walk. He describes those who survived as becoming hideously white in their woolly hair and skin, with their limbs and bodies twisted and turned by the force of the distemper into shocking, grotesque figures resembling woody excrescences or stumps of trees or old Egyptian figures. that seem as if they had been made out of the ends of the human and beginnings of the brutal form. Diseased slave bodies are here described, among other things, as the stunted remains of or the contorted outgrowths from chopped trees. These deformed bodies symbolized resources for slaves to counter both biological and political injustice, as if these stunted organic remains could, much like the hydra-headed cotton tree on the island's south shore, rejuvenate themselves. Earl's novel is titled after the powerful therapeutic bundles created by diseased OB men and women. And we might think of the novel as a kind of textual OB, a medicine that might counteract the destructive forces of Atlantic plantation slavery. But its intertwined treatment of slavery, horticulture, and revolution should be read, I've suggested, in a wider global and transoceanic framework, where we might recognize what Greg Denning referred to as the world systems at work in the most trivial artifacts and actions. And in his book, On Bly, he actually suggested that his Breadfruit project should be read together with Sidney Mintz's Sugar Project. This transoceanic framework might also extend work by Eric Sundquist, Lenore Warren, and others that recognizes the amphibian dimensions to the global age of revolution. Warren notes the years before and after Tacky's rebellion witnessed some of the bloodiest incidents in the history of shipboard insurrection, with 69 shipboard insurrections documented between 1760 and 1771. These ships were poisonous sights for sailors as well as slaves. The abolitionist William Clarkson described the high death rates experienced by sailors aboard slave ships and the abandonment of infected sailors who were left to die in Caribbean ports. Clarkson describes these men lying about the Kingston wharfs with infected ulcers on their legs and bodies that became covered with mosquitoes. The diseased bodies of discarded sailors echo here the diseased and discarded bodies of slaves infected with yaws sent from the plantation to prevent infection. There's a whole discussion I don't have time to have also about the clinical similarities between yaws and syphilis, which provides another transoceanic connection, since there are upwards of 40% of the crew on the Bounty were infected with venereal disease. It's also worth remembering that the Breadfruit transplantation scheme was initially tied to the felon transportation scheme. The ship was intended to stop at Botany Bay with convicts before arriving in Tahiti to pick up the breadfruit destined for the West Indies. The treatment and condition of the bodies of felons, sailors, and slaves should be imagined alongside the care and protection with which Bly's breadfruit trees were carefully carried when they finally arrived in Jamaica in 1793 for miles overland to be safely transplanted into Hinton East's Botanical Garden. And the Botanical Garden, which served as a kind of veil for the plantation, should be countered with the restorative and revolutionary site of the Plantain Walk, or provision ground of the slave. Thanks.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for a really terrific panel. And I guess my question, which is very vague, is for James and Lauren, but it's really to ask you to talk a little bit more about cultural memory in your writing and your sense of methodology of cultural memory in history.
So I've been asked to repeat questions. So James and Lauren, cultural memory in your writings?
All right. That's a really great question, because what's hard to convey about the presentation I just gave is that if you were to read the sources, there's no sort of understanding or reference at all to the weather, to yams, to any of the stuff, to Ojira, right? That's completely written out of the trial record, and part of that is because, one, that the judges, they don't have any textual reference for that. There's no interest really at the time to document slave culture, right? And that's kind of why I suggest that this is an ethnographic event, because there is a clear desire to connect slave resistance to slave culture. So in terms of my own method, that's what was sort of striking about my method for this, is sort of a disconnect between my historical self and my logical self, right? Which was, my historical self was like, well, everything needs to be in the sources, right? Everything needs to be there, and it all needs to be contemporaneous. But then I was like, well, weather is kind of a universal, kind of a universal thing. I mean, I think I can look into that and think about how that works. So in terms of where the project's going, I really want to talk about the sort of ways in which the documenting the conspiracy is this sort of complicated nexus between the art of writing history and then the kind of construction of the archive around African memories, right? Because I think it really reveals that, and there's a sort of particular way in which the moment in which this appears in the archive is really significant as well. So.
Well, so my methodology is. I worry about the methodology because, of course, it's kind of untestable in any sense that historians would feel comfortable with. However, because if I go to Biassou and I say, well, is there, if I ask people, does anyone know who Biassou was? Nobody remembers that, in fact, he was one of the big entrepreneurs who resold liberated slaves and so forth. So, I mean, in a way, I can't excavate these memories in any way that, in any way that I can document. But I do think there's a kind of poetics of memory, because I mean, in the larger project, I got interested in how, for example, in early modern witchcraft research, people kind of conflate all of the demonic apparitions, which often in early modern European witchcraft, you have demons who appear as dogs and in other various forms. But in my material, the pig comes up as the very beloved, and the cattle is very wild, and the dog is very violent. And so, what I started seeing was a huge correspondence between the real history of these animals and the way in which their meaning in the grammar of witchcraft in contemporary Hispaniola. So it seemed to make sense. The pigs, of course, were beloved because they sustained the freedmen in the interior, the monteros or the jibaros, who were able to live off of these packs of wild cattle, which remained into the 20th century in the Dominican Republic. The dogs, of course, were brought in to eat the slaves alive during the Haitian Revolution, after they successfully did so in Jamaica beforehand. And of course, the cattle is the most perplexing in a way because it was most important in the contraband history of the frontier, because after the devastations of Osorio and the Banda Norte was eliminated, the cattle trade passed through Banica and Ange and Tomasik. So this was the front stage of the cattle economy of the 18th century. So cattle is very present, but it wasn't until I started working on this that I kind of put two and two together, and I started seeing all these horns in my own pictures of, and I kind of put the pieces together. So, but it's an assertion I can't really prove in any way that we historians feel comfortable with. But I think if you look at the work of Rosalind Shaw and others who are working on, witchcraft and memory, it explains things that otherwise I cannot explain in my material. So.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Thanks. The one element of Obi that I deal actually least with in this project is the religious one, although as I was listening to the previous two papers, I realized it was probably the way that connects most clearly to them. But these Obi bags, right, when you read the descriptions in the footnotes in Earl's novel, they're essentially made up of these part objects that are all sort of mixed together, and it's just striking me that our research methods are sort of a version of that, right? You sort of take these part objects and put them together in some way, because it's also true, there's no reference to Tahiti or the Pacific or Breadfruit in Earl's novel, but when you look around it at some of the texts with which it's in dialogue, and you look at the historical moment, it clearly is sort of part of the conversation and the thinking that's represented there.
Thank you. Oh, yes, in the very back. Whoops. Oh. I'll get you in a second, Elizabeth. Yes.
The first two speakers, how did you determine that the icon or were there any kind of, let's say, signs or symbols in South America, for example, some of the ethnic fraternities are named, and there's a big debate on whether it's actual memory or where these names come from. But what were your signs that led you to conclude that they were Afghan? And the second case, that the pastoralists were Fulani. Did you see any demographic evidence and any archives that said that there were Fulanis? Because I know you make a comparison and contrast between Fulani traditions in Africa as well as in the rural environment. So my question is, what is your basis? What are your resources to identify these particular traditions?
So this question is about the first two speakers identifying the evidence they use to identify the traditions that they talk about. Go.
So the trial record is very clear, and the testimony from slaves themselves is very clear that it's about a Coromantee rebellion. And as people who study the British West Indies know, Coromantee is this sort of referential term that scholars of kind of African continuities or African cultures have really wrestled with. We really don't know how to define it because, as I said, we know that it's a reference to something about the Gold Coast, right? And historians tend to say, kind of in sort of shorthand, they say, oh, well, it's a Khan culture. But, you know, people living on the Gold Coast didn't think of themselves as a Khan. They thought of themselves as Asante, or they thought of themselves as Ga, or they thought of themselves as, you know, being part of Axum, or they associated with states, you know. And so when you find Coromantee as a reference in the New World, it's a reference about cultural fusion. It's a reference about creating alliances or creating something new. And so in terms of how I see that, I mean, it's clear that there's some reference to the Gold Coast, but how we actually interpret what Coromantee means, I think that's what I'm trying to get at this paper, because we can think about what is the sort of external way, the external factor, the external sort of vector through which people from a wide variety of backgrounds would sort of see commonalities, right, and then be drawn to sort of associate along those lines. I hope that answered your question a little bit. Yeah,
So Thornton, John Thornton says that the lance technology comes from the Wolof. And I think he's saying this, I haven't gone back to his own citations, I need to do that. But I think he's saying this because, of course, the Fulani Wolof had this really important culture of pastoralism. But when I went and looked at the travel accounts of 16th and 17th century Wolof practices, they practically tamed, they were described as being as tame as dogs. These, cattle were really, mansa in Spanish. And so that's where I kind of thought that he's wrong, but that's his citation. I mean, actually, as we know, most of the slaves coming in to Hispaniola were Congo, except for the contraband in slaves to Curacao, which I don't think we can really document their ethnicity. But I'm inclined to think that Thornton is saying because that there's a link to the Wolof because of the particular kind of lance that they used that had a curved portion where they cut the Achilles heel of the beast, but the cult of the feral bull that I observe in the practices of sorcery, and also the fact that there was this very important link between the feral cattle, the extensive cattle ranching of Spain, and the feral cattle economy. I think actually there may be more of a Spanish connection, but I still need to plot that out. But this is something I'm still grappling with myself, but I'm inclined to think that Thornton's wrong in this one.
Elizabeth?
you want me to just go?
Yes.
Okay. I'll repeat the question, which is to say more about the revolutionary vegetable economy. Why is it revolutionary to become a vegetable? And whose language is this? I'll start at the back. I think that Earl is getting it from Darwin, but actually your question about whether there may be other historical and cultural sources for this, namely in the Creole or African worlds, I think is an excellent one. I'm not sure I'm able to answer that definitively for you, and it may be that Earl's novel is drawing from a number of sources that is sort of hybridizing various histories and cultural languages. As far as what is revolutionary about being vegetable, in Darwin's, especially that when people read Darwin's Botanic Garden, they tend to read the second volume, which is called The Loves of Plants, which basically taught 18th century readers Linnaean categories, but did it through this very sexualized language of plants. And so it's kind of the more exciting of the two volumes. The first volume is called The Economy of Vegetation, and it really describes an economy of this vegetable world that is run through with this sort of electrical circulatory systems, and what's interesting about the volume is how much a role politics plays there, and in particular revolutionary politics. And repeatedly for Darwin, political revolutions are sort of manifestations of this, these electrical forces are sort of rebalancing themselves. So there's a language that runs throughout that volume of sort of cycles, rotations, orbs, this notion of cyclical turning, and revolutions happen in the natural world for Earl when things have become sort of out of balance. And so for Darwin, revolutions happen in order to sort of readjust to that natural, almost organic imbalance. And so it's almost as if the vegetable world models that kind of revolutionary politics for him.